easy. It's great to see you all. Welcome. I want to welcome Ian Buruma. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to have you tonight. And before we get started, I wanted to tell you about some upcoming events that we're going to have. So on May 20th, we have, I sent an announcement out. I think most of you got it. If you didn't, then let me know afterwards if I didn't get your email. On May 20th will be Jim Rassenberger speaking about A Perfect Coincidence, the extraordinary friendship and astonishing deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And then on June 3rd, we will have Michael Gross, who will speak on his new book, Treasured Island, The Story of St. Bart's and Its Barbarians, Billionaires, and Beauties, subtitled Hookers and Love. And then it's actually a very serious book about the history of the island. It's really quite fascinating. I just finished it recently. And lastly, Victoria Johnson will speak on her new book, Glorious Country, How the Artist Frederick Church Brought the World to America and America to the World. So Ian, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. Ian Buruma was born in the Netherlands. He studied Chinese at Leiden University and cinema at Nihon University, Tokyo. He was cultural editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong, foreign editor of The Spectator, London, and editor of the New York Review of Books. His articles have appeared in papers and periodicals all over the world, including the Financial Times, the New Yorker, and Harper's. He is professor of journalism and human rights at Bard College, New York. He is a columnist for Project Syndicate and has a podcast called Into Asia. He's written more than 20 books, including Murder in Amsterdam, Year Zero, Tokyo, Romance, and Spinoza. So welcome, Ian.
Thank you. That may be a bit premature.
So Ian, why this book? What led you down this path?
I was always very curious about what happened to my parents and their lives. And my father worked in Berlin in a factory. He was forced to work there from 1943 until the end of the war. And what happened was that the Germans ran out of manpower, and because all the young men were fighting on the battlefront. And so they decided men in occupied countries had to come fill that gap. POWs and slaves and so on were not enough. And students, and my father was a student at the time, were given an option. If they signed a loyalty oath to the occupying Nazi government, this could be postponed. And my father refused, like more than 70% of the students, and went into hiding, and something went wrong. He was called back to his hometown. And he was faced with a dilemma. And that's perhaps what interests me most. It certainly haunted him. He was at a railway station with my grandfather, and surrounded by the German police, and they announced that those who did not sign up for labor in Germany, that not only would they get into trouble, but their parents would be arrested. And so my father and his father, my grandfather, had a long discussion about this, and my father decided he didn't want to risk this, and so ended up in Berlin. Was haunted because working for the enemy was not well thought of. The ones who had remained in hiding as fellow students looked rather askance after the war, people who had been in Germany and so on. But it's a dilemma that me, not having been born at the time, I was born 6 years after the end of the war, I would never want to morally judge it. I think it's one of those dilemmas that are very, well, you can't morally judge it. And it's one of the reasons I've always, not always, but I've been interested for a long time, not only what happened to the victims. And my mother's side of the family were Jewish, but they were in Britain, and so they weren't involved directly in the Holocaust. But I had an interest in what it was like to be among the perpetrators in Japan, where I spent some years, and in Germany, because among the perpetrators you're faced with these dilemmas. You're faced with this problem that we might, if we're unlucky, face at some point, is how to remain decent in an indecent state. And that's really what brought me to this. And I found the letters that my father sent home during his years in Berlin. And as I said, he was not Jewish, so he had a certain amount of freedom when he was not too exhausted from the bombings and the malnourishment and so on. He could roam around a bit, and saw a concert conducted by Furtwängler in 1944 with holes in the roof and the musicians in the audience all sitting there in winter coats. And so the letters are also an account of a provincial student living in a metropolis for the first time in his life. So you get a glimpse of daily life in Berlin through these letters that fascinated me. And so that was really what sparked it. So it was my father's letters, it was the interest in living in a society which has gone very badly wrong, and that's how I got into it.
So and the letters weren't censored. Or
Well, they were.
Where they were.
So you have to be very careful reading these letters, because he of course he was very well aware that they were read, and so he knew that he couldn't say exactly what he thought, certainly not about the Germans. He was also keen not to make his parents too worried so he was a bit laconic about the bombings, for example, which I know from his own account were terrible. But he didn't quite say that to his parents. He was sort of saying, oh, well, things are not too bad, and so on. But what the experience of living in Berlin, and that's perhaps another aspect of this, gave him a peculiar perspective on the Germans that people who remained in an occupied country didn't have. If you were living under German or Nazi occupation, every German was basically a villain, because you were dealing with German soldiers, with the SS and so on and so forth. They were all villains, and that's the atmosphere I grew up in. I grew up, my generation, the Germans were the bad guys, we were the good guys, which made life very simple, morally. Later we realized that things were not quite so clean cut. But my father's experience gave him a more nuanced view from the very beginning, because it was one thing living in an occupied country and feeling that every German was a villain. It's another thing living in Berlin at the time, and around the people around him. There were good Germans, there were bad Germans, there were Nazis, there were people who didn't like the Nazis, and you were vulnerable to the same dangers and so on. So he was never viscerally anti-German in the way that my mother, who was at school in Britain, and we did lose some family, not many, in the Holocaust. But my mother wouldn't buy German products and that kind of thing. My father was not like that.
What was fascinating to me was, in the book, was how people, obviously the gradual decline of civilization, and that there were turning points, we all know them, but you describe them so beautifully in terms of Jews losing their right to do this and that, and then finally just sort of falling into Armageddon. But he seems to have experienced that in a way. I mean, as an observer, it was just so fascinating to me that he was an outsider to a certain extent looking in. But how much did people know about the horrors that were going on outside? And what was sort of the turning point of knowledge, of Berliners knowing the worst aspects
I
of the
don't know
war,
if there
or
was
were there,
yeah, I don't know if there was a turning point. I mean, one of the things you learn from examining that period is how easy it is to look away. And Goebbels, who was propaganda minister as well as the Gauleiter of Berlin, it makes it very clear in his diaries that he deliberately wanted non-Jewish Berliners or Germans in general to feel that life was still sort of continuing fairly normally. And he says somewhere in his diaries that propaganda is important, but people should never be bored. And so the cinemas were full, the dance reviews still went on, the theatres, there was a musical life, there was a football competition, and so on. So, and Jews, of course, were a very small percentage of the population. People often forget that. I mean, because of anti-Semitic propaganda, sometimes you might get the impression that Jews were sort of dominating public life in Germany and so on. which is complete nonsense. It was a very small percentage of the population, a bit larger in Berlin and prominent in certain professions, but it was easy to sort of pretend it was not going on. But I still had the luck that I was able to interview people for this book who are now in their 90s, who have childhood memories. And one of them said something which I think is very true. She said, never forget, if you wanted to know, you could know. And many people, of course, didn't want to know because it makes life easier. You sleep better. Why do you want to? So, but things did. Absolutely, you could know because, for example, Grunewald, which is one of the wealthier areas of Berlin, the Grunewald station is where the last trains to Poland left, and people could see the Jews being herded to the station and so on. It wasn't hidden. So how much people know? There is also a question of knowing and not taking it on board. I knew the philosopher Isaiah Berlin a bit at the end of his life. He was in Washington during the war. He was Chaim Weizmann's assistant. He knew all the right people, and Felix Frankfurter and all those people. He always maintained that he hadn't known about the full extent of the Holocaust until after the war. Now, it's very hard to imagine that can be true, because Anne Frank, a teenager locked up in an attic, writes about it in her diary. She says that most of us, once we disappear into Poland, they say we're going to be gassed. She heard it on the BBC radio. But this doesn't mean Isaiah Berlin was lying. I think what it means is that he kind of knew, but he didn't quite want to know and pushed it slightly aside, and it was so horrifying, it was almost unimaginable. Didn't want to rock the boat, perhaps. But so knowing and not knowing is a complicated issue.
Can you talk about how Berlin was different from other cities? It was obviously an intellectual capital. It was fascinating to me that Hitler clearly felt that Berliners were more of a threat to challenging his ideology than any other city. But
well, the Nazis never liked Berlin very much, never trusted it. They didn't trust Berliners, and many Berliners didn't trust the Nazis because, like all extreme right-wing movements, the Nazi movement was basically anti-metropolitan and anti-cosmopolitan. It was provincial in its roots. It was a revolt in some ways of the provinces against the big city and everything the big city represents. I mean, in the politics of this country, you see the same pattern. I mean, the people who hate New York because it's full of gays and foreigners and immigrants and black people and so on. That was also the view, of course, of the Nazis of Berlin. So they felt more comfortable in the provinces, even in Munich, or Nuremberg, than they did in Berlin. Hamburg, again, was a peculiar case, because Hamburg was a Hanseatic city, very much a commercial place, Anglophile. So the bourgeoisie of Hamburg would go to the yacht club and have names like Mickey and Bobby and so on. So when they were horribly bombed in 43, I think it was, a lot of the Hamburgers said, sort of, why us? I mean, we love England. Why pick on us? But Berlin was the symbol of cosmopolitan life, and so not liked by the Nazis. They didn't feel comfortable there. Although, of course, there were plenty of Nazis in Berlin too. One shouldn't idealize it, but it was special.
Interesting. Can you tell us about the organization of the book and sort of how you chose to how the story unfolds?
Yes, I decided to do it chronologically because and something's in my mind where and there are people here who can no doubt tell me which paintings I mean. I think it might have been Frederick Church, but it's a common theme in Western art history. The theme of the glittering city with its glitter and gold and tall buildings and the sort of Babylonian city. And then there's the painting of the Rack and Ruin, which, is it Frederick Church?
Thomas Cole.
Thomas Cole.
Of course,
But that idea was sort of in my mind, that I wanted to show the process of a great city that was Berlin, and gradually and in the end dramatically ending up as a pile of rubble. So I decided to do it chronologically. The other thing in my mind, to some extent, was the kind of modernism that was very popular in Berlin and elsewhere in the 1920s. And my favorite novel, one of my favorite novels of all time, is Alfred Dublin's Berlin Alexanderplatz. And Berlin Alexanderplatz is the story of which Fassbinder later made into a beautiful series of films for television. And it's the story of a working class man and how he gets involved in the eastern part of Berlin in crime and so on and so forth. And Dublin himself was a doctor, a Jewish doctor, who worked in the poor parts of Berlin around Alexanderplatz. And the technique he uses is the way that we experience metropolitan life in fragments. So there's a lot of Berlin slang in it, but there are commercials, there are popular songs, there are images constantly in the book that make a kind of mosaic of city life. And there's another famous documentary by Ruttmann, I think it's called Berlin and Metropolis, but something like that, also made in the 20s, which uses the same thing, the way you see a city when you're sitting in a bus or a tram, just flashes of it. So I decided it had to be a mosaic of personal experiences gleaned from letters and memoirs and so on, of newspaper articles, of commercials, of films and popular songs and so on, that would bring the life of the period, alive.
Can you talk about, to that point, can you talk about, you referenced the films in the book, like Juice, Seuss, and Königsberg, and can you talk a little bit about that? So I found that absolutely fascinating, how they pulled that off.
One thing that, again, because Goebbels didn't want people to be bored, so he was very keen that cultural life should go on, and was even keen that people should be entertained by it. And there are two viciously anti-Semitic films made, both of them made in 41, I believe. One is Juice Seuss, made by quite a good director, called Veit Harlan, whose niece later married Stanley Kubrick. And Kubrick and her uncle, his wife's uncle, got on perfectly well as long as they discussed movies. And Juice Seuss is a viciously anti-Semitic film. I mean, it cannot be more vicious than that. The other one is the Eternal Jew, Die ewige Jude, which is also a terrible film, where you see images of Jews in big cities and then cuts to images of rats in a sewer and that kind of thing. But these films, Seuss was quite a success and actually won the award at the Venice Film Festival at the time, and was played to quite full houses in Paris. But the other film was not very successful, and I think, in any case, I don't entirely know the reason why, but they never really made films like that again during the war. And it may be because people were slightly bored with that kind of propaganda. They preferred comedies and romance and that kind of stuff. So most of the films made during the war at the UFA studios were not out and out propaganda. And even in the comedies, or even the films about brave Luftwaffe pilots and that kind of thing, very few references to the Nazis. You don't see people flinging up their arms and saying Heil Hitler. And clearly the audiences didn't really want to see that, I think. But there were some films made which were really good. And the most interesting one was a film that Goebbels decided had to out Hollywood. It had to be better than a Hollywood picture, with more vivid colors and more dramatic and so on. Better than the Thief of Baghdad and all those films. And the budget was unlimited, and they had the cream of German actors who are still there. Not a terribly good director, but Goebbels decided that he didn't want the script to be written by some studio hack. It had to be a serious writer, and the writer that was chosen to write it was Erich Kästner, famous of Emil and his detectives. And Erich Kästner, before the war, had written a very biting satire of the Nazis. The Nazis hated him, they burnt all his books. In the 30s, he was not allowed to publish anything. He was a persona non grata, but he continued to live in Berlin. He took the job, he was a writer, he wanted to work, and wrote an absolutely brilliant script. And because with certain scenes in it which are slightly satirical, and because the budget was not an issue, they also insisted that everything had to be genuine. So there were scenes of 18th century Germany, being the Baron Munchausen. So they had real Meissen porcelain and real sort of antique silver and that kind of thing. But in order to prevent people from stealing any of this, they had SS officers dressed in 18th century Baroque uniform clothes in the scenes guarding all these goodies. But and once Hitler found out that Erich Kästner had written the script, he went into one of his rages, and Kästner was never allowed to write anything again. But it shows that even in those circumstances, and in this way, Hitler's Berlin was different, let's say, from Mao's China, in which such a film could never have been made. There was just enough room for interesting things still to be made. And of course musical life went on. Now the question is, does anybody who, even if they're not Nazis, even if they don't like the Nazis, is anybody who participates in that culture under those circumstances guilty of a kind of collaboration? Now Thomas Mann, who left in the 30s, partly because he was married to a Jewish wife, but also because he was a genuine opponent of the Nazis and might have been in danger, took a very harsh view. He felt anybody who stayed was culpable. Any book, he said famously in 1945 on the BBC, he said any book written under the Nazis is drenched in blood and should be pulped. Now, people didn't take kindly to that kind of thing necessarily. I mean, there were writers who had not been Nazis, who went into what they called inner emigration and kept their thoughts to themselves, felt that it's all very well for Thomas Mann lecturing them from his house in California, but they had to live through this period and cope with it and so on. And Furtwängler is the other case. He felt, like Thomas Mann, that wherever he was German high culture. Thomas Mann felt that the only way to keep that culture untainted was to be outside the Third Reich. Furtwängler felt he couldn't conduct his music and so on if he was severed from his cultural roots, decided to stay. Toscanini, Furtwängler's Italian colleague, took the view that anybody who conducts under the Nazis is complicit. Again, I hesitate to judge people morally from a position where I've been lucky enough never to be faced by this kind of problem.
Well, must be a moral dilemma for somebody. I watched that film actually, and I found it really so beautiful visually. It's an extraordinary film, and as you said, done at great expense. It's a very slow and
Munchausen.
Munchausen, yeah, about Baron Munchausen. But it's really beautiful. I would encourage you to watch at least the first.
It's all on YouTube.
20 or 30. Yeah.
All these Nazi films are on YouTube.
So what were the greatest surprises in the telling of the story? Where did you sort of take a turn or discover something that you hadn't anticipated?
It's always difficult in retrospect because you forget being surprised. I suppose the main thing is that I hadn't realized quite how long people can pretend that life goes on. And a much more macabre example of that, kind of human resilience, which in one hand is admirable and the other hand is slightly eerie, is the story of what happened in, for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto, where conditions were far, 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 far worse than for anybody in Berlin. And even then, when people were dying in the streets of hunger, when they knew that they were probably going to be murdered, etc., and so on and so forth, schools still went on, papers were published, concerts were organized, and so on. And which shows an extraordinary human capacity to adapt. And I don't want to compare for a second life in Berlin to life in the Warsaw Ghetto, but this was true of Berlin too. Life does go on.
And that's the way to protect yourself.
It's a way to protect yourself.
Have routine.
Absolutely.
Even in dire circumstances.
Absolutely. So that's somewhat surprised me.
Interesting. Well, thank you. This is wonderful, and we will open it up to questions.
Sorry.
The Kestner you mentioned, it is the Kestner who wrote The Darkness on the Moon?
No. That's Arthur Koestler. Arthur Koestler lived in England during the war. No, Erich Kästner,
Okay.
who of Emil and his Detectives. That's his most famous book.
And was he Jewish?
No. And he decided to stay. He wrote an extraordinary book which has only been published long after the war, as far as I know, called The Blue Book, Das Blaue Buch, where it's his journals during the war. And he says, he explains why he decided to stay, because he was famous enough that he could have left. Like Furtwängler could have easily left, and he could have conducted any way he wanted. And Kästner said, German was his language, Germany was his country. It was his duty to chronicle what was going on in his native country, even in its worst days. He refused to be chased out of the place he felt he belonged. And he also was devoted to his mother, who lived in Dresden. So devoted, he would send his laundry to her every day.
Devoted. That might not be the right word.
But she couldn't face leaving, and so he couldn't face leaving her. Now, there's a case of somebody who stayed for, it seems to me, perfectly understandable reasons.
Constantine.
You had a marvelous phrase earlier, inward immigration.
Yes.
Could you expand on that?
Yes, that's not my phrase. I mean, it was coined by the people who stayed. It's inner immigration, and what it means is that you retreat, as it were, inside yourself. So you keep your thoughts to yourself. You try and stay untainted by your surroundings. You don't publish anything that could be considered to be propaganda or anything like that. You emigrate, but by staying where you are, but by not participating. Now, Thomas Mann did not think that was a good enough excuse. He thought that was self-justification and so on.
He was writing from the comfort of his house.
He was writing from his country, from his house in California. But so that made him quite unpopular, and Thomas Mann never lived in Germany again. I mean, he did leave the United States, but lived in Switzerland.
A lot of quotations from Goebbels' diary. Are the diaries still excellent? I would have thought he would burned them.
No, they were never burnt. No, the diaries are absolutely
And they're, where are they located?
on the internet.
As good a place as any.
The physical diaries, I don't know,
Yeah.
but they've been republished quite a few times. But I don't know where the originals are. That I don't know.
There was a definitive biography of him that came out about 5 years ago, which
Yes.
is quite a big read, but apparently very thorough in his interpretations.
And it's the work of a man who was clearly intelligent. He was monstrous, but he was no fool. He wasn't.
He seems to know what he was doing. I mean,
Yes, I
he's
think he-
very specific.
But I think he was not. He was very cynical in many ways, but I think he was also a true believer. I think he rarely sort of worshipped Hitler.
And he committed suicide with his children at the end.
Which is one of the horrifying act. Yeah.
But he was brilliant in the way he unfolded certain topics, and he would sort of realize, he was smart enough to realize that he'd gone a little bit too far
Yes.
at times. I think you described
He
that
really
before.
understood propaganda.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
absolutely true.
Other questions?
Did the writing of this book change your understanding of your parents in any way?
Of my father, specifically. No, what struck me actually not at all, because he wrote those letters home and to his best friend when he was 19, 20, 21. And what surprised me was how much the letters show a man that I knew. I mean, he was very much in the letters already, the man I knew. And the same sense of humor, the same way of thinking about things, and so on. So, no, I didn't really discover anything that I didn't know about him. I think and again, because of the censorship at the time, it's hard to know exactly what he really thought. But you do get the impression of somebody who grew up in a sheltered and very provincial milieu, and that he was not savvy in the way that if you were a Jew in Berlin, you had to be just to survive. But also that people who grew up in Berlin probably were. I mean, I think he was slightly oblivious to certain things that were going on. But again, it's very difficult to know, because if he wasn't oblivious, he wouldn't have been able to probably say so.
Had you read his letters many times and talked to your father about them, or you just?
No, I really read them very soon after he died. I certainly talked to my father about his experiences quite a lot. He wasn't reticent, and I was curious.
Did he not want to share the letters with you?
No, for
before?
some reason that he kept quiet about those letters. They were in a metal box, and I don't know if there's any meaning to this. But he never said, why don't you read my letters? They were there. He kept them, but no. Unfortunately, I wish I could have said, what did you mean by that? And what did you mean by that? He may not have known himself anymore.
But was it an incredible discovery? You just came upon them and just said, "Oh my God, what have we? This is an amazing."
Yes.
How many letters were there?
God, I haven't counted them, but a few hundred.
So there's a book out now that's gotten a lot of attention called The Director. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
So it's fiction, but it's loosely based on
G.W. Pabst, who was the famous film director.
who was not Jewish, who had come to Hollywood, who had a very heavy German accent and really couldn't finesse Hollywood. And so, to make a long story short, he goes back to Austria. He's Austrian. And he goes back to Austria in the book because his mother is, whatever, he's a little bit duped into going back to Austria. But he goes to a cocktail party in Hollywood, and there's a fellow who's very Hollywood looking, who turns out to be a German recruiter. to get him and says, you know, you'll have all the budget and you'll have all the artistic control, and it's, you know, that in the end he ends up collaborating with Lena Wertmüller. But it's what's so interesting about the book is the insidious, even though I'm not sure that he made propaganda, to your point. I think he just made films
Yes.
to entertain the German people, but the insidious
Yes.
of daily life and the evil, and there are just only certain incidents that involve his child, involve other, you know, you don't see it. And then there's the, I don't know, the keystone of the arch, that he needs extras, and they're running out of budget and they use concentration camp.
Yes, well, just to protect Lena Wertmüller's reputation, I think you mean Leni Riefenstahl.
Oh yes, I do. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Right at the end of the war, my father was actually in a house that belonged to the widow of a Jewish lawyer in Dahlem, around the corner from where Leni Riefenstahl lived, and he remembers seeing her Mercedes parked out there. But the use of concentration camp prisoners that goes back to the very beginning, well, to the 30s, because Leni Riefenstahl herself used them. And there's a film where she uses gypsies who were sent to Auschwitz. And she was not a nice person. And
Well, that's what I mean. I mean,
Yeah.
this is throughout the book. That was not a unique.
No,
That's what I mean about the insidious.
yes.
In the pursuit of art, all this evil
Yes,
happens.
but Pabst, of course, unlike Leni Riefenstahl, was not a Nazi, which makes it even more poignant, that book, because Pabst was trapped in Germany and was a filmmaker. He wanted to work. He was an artist, and so did compromise himself. But what was analogous to your story is what happened at the end of the war, when the only way to stay out of being dragooned into taking part in the suicidal last battles against the Soviet Red Armies coming in, actors and film crews and so on had to keep working. And so films at the end of the war took longer and longer and longer to complete, because otherwise they knew they would be drafted. And the last film made by, it wasn't Veit Harlan, it was somebody else. The very last film was shot on near the Polish-German border, and they just kept shooting and shooting and shooting with an empty camera.
Brilliant. We have time for one more question. Duncan?
Could you describe
Just hold that. Just hold it.
life in Berlin maybe for the 3 years after the end of the war?
Yes, I think it was very tough. Certainly the first year after the war, and it depended on which sector you were in. If you were in the Soviet sector, it was different from being in the French and the British and the American sectors. But I think for many people it was very, very tough. Of course, outside Germany, very few people cared particularly about the toughness of life for Germans. Both sides, because the Cold War, which had not officially begun, but began pretty quickly, were already in competition, of course. And the Anglo-American allies were afraid that if they didn't feed the Germans quickly and make sure that they didn't have outbreaks of disease and starvation and so on, people could go over to the communist side. Even in Britain at the time, where people were also rationed and there wasn't very much food and so on, were told to tighten their belts because food had to go to Germany. And on the other side, the Russians did a lot to revive German culture, of course along Soviet communist lines, but the Brecht ensemble and so on started at that same time. So on the whole, life recovered remarkably quickly, because both sides were very keen that Germany wouldn't fall into a great deep hole. There were the usual problems that happen in any country after a war, but especially acute when you've lost a war, that you have lots of soldiers returning, demoralized, often sick. They had no standing any longer, and women had to take over responsibility over their children and so on, had to work, sometimes work in very unsavory professions. So it was psychologically probably very difficult as well. I mean, those who've seen the Fassbinder film, The Marriage of Maria Braun, get a very good idea of this, or what it was like. And Germany revived pretty quickly, and the first time it got back, and the film about the Fassbinder film ends with that. The moment for the first time people felt not so bad about being Germans again was when Germany beat Hungary in the World Cup soccer final in 1954. And it was an enormous event in Germany. Again, not something that people outside Germany rejoiced over it particularly, but the Germans did. It was the first time that they felt, well, we're back now, or at least we're getting back. But yeah, it was hard times. And then you got the German-speaking populations from Czechoslovakia and Silesia and so on, who were often destitute and streaming into Germany by the millions. We're not popular with the local population. So you had that problem. And those people and their families often became rather revanchist and right-wing. So you had all these, a lot of problems.
Ian, this has been wonderful. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction to your book, and I'm sure all of you will read it and of course tell others. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.